Hello everybody and welcome to 3D Printing Basics. I just wanted to let you know that if you're interested in getting every single episode a week before its release and ad-free, then please head over to my Patreon. The link will be in the show notes, and like I said, you can get every single episode ad-free and a week before its initial release date. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you like this episode. Hello and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 96, and in this week's episode we are going to be talking about what happens when you leave a printer running overnight. We're going to talk about risks, safety, best practices that you can use to ensure success, and I feel like this episode is long overdue because I would say that just about every single night I have one of my printers running. Sometimes all of them, sometimes less, but oftentimes I would say probably 90% of the nights I am leaving the printers running. And I would definitely say that there is a large amount of the time that the printers are upstairs working on their own. And so I think since I have a lot of experience in it, it's time to go over some of the things that you can look for to make sure that you can confidently leave your prints overnight without worrying about anything at all. So with that being said, let's get right into today's episode. All right, let's jump right into it. So what actually happens when you are sleeping or when you leave your printer unattended? Honestly, nothing. It's not like the old adage, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. No, we know what the printer is doing. It's running as normal. There's nothing going on. The printer keeps running. The temps are staying high. Everything is looking good. The motion systems are running. If something fails, though, that is where you kind of may have an issue because it may keep failing for hours and hours unchecked. I've definitely had a fair amount of prints that fail within an hour after leaving them overnight, and then they spend the next 8, 9, 10 hours continually failing, and then you get the giant spaghetti monster. But on the bright side, there are a lot of printers nowadays that will be able to detect a failure or just run into a sort of fail-safe when a print fails so that it will stop and it will save you lots of filament. But that is something to definitely consider. If you have a risky print or something that you think may have a higher chance of failing than usual, you might want to save that for a daytime run when you can continually monitor it. That way you can double check and make sure that everything is going good. But if you have a pretty safe print, something that maybe you've run before or something that doesn't have a lot of complicated geometry, especially if you have something that doesn't use any supports, because supports, they increase the chances of failure pretty drastically. If you don't use supports, then you should be good to go. So you should be pretty safe to run it, but that is definitely things to consider for what you are actually going to be doing when you run your part overnight. And some common overnight failure scenarios, you got the print detaching from the bed, probably the most common one. This can definitely happen if you're like in a garage or if you're in a non-climate controlled space. Obviously, it gets much colder in the nighttime than it does in the daytime, pretty much wherever you are. And that can lead to the shrinkage or the premature shrinkage of the bottom layer, which then causes it to pop off the print bed. And like I said earlier, that can cause the spaghetti monster where it keeps on failing for hours and hours and hours, and that just wastes filament and can be really hard to clean up. You can also have something like a nozzle clog or under extrusion. This isn't as bad, and most of the times when you're just having a little bit of under extrusion, then you can save the part. But if you are having tons of under extrusion problems, then that part is going to be unusable, and then you have the same scenario where it ran for hours and hours, constantly under extruding and wasting filament. Another thing that you can definitely have is layer shifts or mechanical errors. You can have, like, say, a printer missed a step or the belt slips. You can definitely have a layer shift. Most of my layer shifts come from the poop chute on the Bambu Lab printers being clogged, and so they basically build up and up and up until the nozzle can't clear it anymore, and then it basically runs into that solid mound of plastic, and that causes the layer shift. But that is definitely something that can happen and something that you definitely need to keep an eye out for. You can also have a filament runout, which isn't as big of a deal anymore as most printers have a filament runout sensor. But at the end of the day, if you have a filament runout sensor and it runs out, then you're pausing the print. And if you do that early in the day and you don't get the notification or you don't catch it early in the night, then you just have it sitting there pretty much just maintaining its heat, which is again wasting power because it still needs to stay hot for when you come back in the morning. But it's just sitting there and not really doing anything for you. So those are some common overnight failure scenarios that you should definitely be looking out for and you should be considering when you're running your printer overnight. Now, I was kind of debating whether I wanted to go over this next section. I figure I will, but I just wanted to let you know that this is it's such an uncommon scenario that I don't want it to scare anybody off from overnight printing, but there is a fire risk. You can definitely, the hot end and the heated bed running for 12 hours on end during the night, not being watched, being unguarded, it can definitely lead to some issues. If you have the exact right situation pop up, then you can definitely have a fire that sparks, and then of course you either aren't there, you don't notice it, and it can cause some serious damage. But in my time 3D printing, there's been about 5 or 6 years of printing. I've heard of one scenario where a fire broke out because of a 3D printer, and that was on like a first generation Prusa that was 10 years old. So again, these fire risks are like the first thing that 3D printers are equipped with being able to stop. So they have their thermal runaway, they have some things like that, and they're built good. I don't want to say great. They are built good, but they're built good enough to be able to not have that be a risk. So at the end of the day, there is a small risk of that, but it's not huge and definitely shouldn't be scaring you away from doing overnight printing, especially if you are running it in your own home. You also have noise and vibration. If you have your 3D printers in your room like I did back when I just started, I couldn't run prints overnight because it was just too noisy. I couldn't sleep. I thought it might be like white noise, but at the end of the day, it was just annoying. So I could never run my printers overnight. And of course, like we mentioned, the waste of time and materials. Especially if you're using like an engineering filament, something that's expensive, and you have a failure and it runs for 6 to 12 hours, that can really hurt your wallet. So that's definitely something to consider. So now that we've gone over the risks of the overnight material or the overnight prints, let's talk about what makes an overnight print more likely to succeed. And so what we're going to do is we want to start with a proven setup. So I would say don't overnight a printer that's unreliable, something that may have been broken or something that has a pretty low success rate, something that you maybe a printer that you've been having issues with, and use profiles that have already worked well. So this kind of goes in with what I was saying at the beginning of the episode. If you're considering running prints overnight, I would definitely say don't start an overnight print with a print that you haven't done before. If you can and you've managed to run a test print first and it worked great during the day when you were watching it, then you should be good to go, because that's something that 3D printers are very good at. They're very good at being repeatable and pretty much coming out with the expected result every single time, as long as it's kind of proofed the first run. So as long as you have a print that you've ran before and everything looks good there, then you should totally be good to run it overnight as much as you want. And this will be helpful if you're cranking out a bunch of parts, because you can kind of start with one, maybe it takes a little while, maybe an hour or two, and then you can fill the bed plate with maybe 20 of them, and then you can run it overnight, and that takes 12 hours. And then you wake up in the morning and you have 20 new parts that just weren't there before, and that's definitely something to consider. So test prints are very, very important, and make sure that you have the good bed adhesion and the good first layer. So make sure you have a nice clean bed. If you are printing a really long print, you might want to consider some bed adhesive, either some Magigoo or Bambu Labs version of it, which I find pretty good. You make sure that you have the proper Z offset. Again, for Bambu Labs, you don't really need to worry about it, but you still should double check the first layer if you definitely can before you leave for the night. Usually what I do is when I'm running these prints overnight is I always check the first layer, make sure it's laying down good before I leave. I don't just press start and then just completely leave. You got to make sure that the first layer is going down good to make sure that you have left yourself with the highest chance of getting a good print. And again, make sure you're using reliable filament. I wouldn't say an overnight print is the optimal place to test a filament that you've never used before, something like a carbon fiber nylon or PEEK or an engineering filament that you never tried before. If you're using something like PLA or PETG, something that you've used a bunch of times over, it should be more than fine to use on these overnight prints. Now that we know kind of what practices to enact to make sure we have good overnight prints, some smart upgrades that will definitely help is an enclosure, whether you're printing PLA or PETG or TPU or any kind of engineering filaments. An enclosure will always help, especially for nighttime, because the temperature can fluctuate very much so. It can fluctuate by 10, 20, maybe even 30 degrees. An enclosure will help keep that temperature stability. Even though it's not recommended for PLA, I almost always print overnight with the enclosure completely enclosed just so that the temperature stays consistent. I'll take a consistent temperature that might be a little bit too high rather than the proper temperature that is fluctuating all over the place, because that is going to contribute to your print maybe not working as well as it should. And you can also use cameras for remote monitoring. If you have a really questionable print that you've decided to run, then you can definitely hook up a wireless camera to watch the print, and then you can use a phone app or something like that to kind of stop it if you have any issues, or you can pause it if you have any issues. And you can also use a smart plug for emergency shutdown if you don't have like the Bamboo apps, or if you have a printer that doesn't connect to in a mobile app that you can remotely start and stop. You can use a smart plug, and then that way you can kind of just shut the power off if you see a print getting out of hand. And of course, make sure that you have a printer that has the auto bed leveling to make sure that you have the good first layer, although that comes with most printers nowadays. And the power loss recovery features. They are underrated on 3D printers. If you have a power loss, if you turn on the smart plug or turn it off for an emergency shutdown, or if you just lost power in the middle of the night, the power loss recovery feature is going to save your 3D prints more often than not. Sometimes I've noticed you definitely have some issues with maybe you have a layer shift, or maybe the print was just left too long without power and everything cooled down and then it popped off the build plate. But if you are able to get to it quick enough, the power loss recovery feature will completely save your print. And I also just wanted to go over really quick before we ended the episode when you should not run an overnight print. And that is for when you are running your first print on your brand new printer. That is not when you should run an overnight print. Your first print on a new printer, you want to make sure you are watching that thing. Make sure nothing is going wrong. Every kind of wire, no wires are crossed. All the belts are running good. Everything is looking good. That is definitely when you are going to want to monitor that. And after major hardware changes, say you just really modified or heavily upgraded your printer, you definitely want to make sure that you're watching the first print to make sure that all your upgrades are helping the printer and not hurting the printer. If you're using a brand new filament, especially like an engineering filament, like if you're using PEEK for the first time, or maybe a carbon fiber or glass filled filament for the first time, you're going to want to make sure you're monitoring that. Don't leave it overnight. And when the printer has been acting unreliable. If your printer is not consistent, then an overnight print is not the time to use that printer. Use another one if you have it, or try and fix the printer and get it back to being reliable again before you run an overnight print, because they will hurt you more than they will help you. And if the print has critical tolerances, or is just a high cost part anyway, if you're running like a 12-hour print that is a really high tolerance part, something for maybe aviation or aerospace, and using some really expensive filament, you probably shouldn't run it overnight. You probably want to be monitoring that to make sure that everything is looking good, and if something does go wrong, then you could stop it immediately, saving as much money as possible. But with that being said, that's kind of all I had for you guys today. I hope that you guys enjoyed the episode and learned a little something about running prints overnight. Like I said, there are probably 90% of the nights in the year I'm running a printer of some kind, and I have a lot more successes than failures. I can't put an exact number on it, but it's probably in the 85 to 90% success rate. So all you got to do is just kind of keep in mind the things that I talked about, and then you should be able to keep getting successful overnight prints and saving yourself tons of time. So thank you guys so much for listening and supporting the podcast. It really means a lot to me, and I'll talk to you guys next time.